I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to deconversion and atheist issues in relationship to Bible theology and politics. So you're free to share these videos as much as you like. In fact, I would appreciate it because the purpose is to spread some educational values about these issues. Today, I'm offering up part 2 of my revised first anniversary of the channel edition of my deconversion story. I'll link the original deconversion story over my head, and I'll link part 1 right after it. So if you haven't watched part 1, you might want to get that, because that gives all the background leading up to this part of the story, where I cover from my childhood all the way up to the moment of my deconversion that I cite as the moment of my deconversion. That moment where I kind of shifted from being a theist to being not a theist, and certainly not a Christian. It was about, I want to say 2014, 2015, I was preaching a series of messages on salvation. My preaching tends to follow in series where I don't feel that one sermon for 20 minutes is enough to cover a topic efficiently, so I preach series of messages throughout my ministry career. And it kind of keeps people coming back. It's like having one episode after another. And so I was preaching a series of messages on sin and salvation. And at the time, I was also reading a lot of critics of the Bible, because I was struggling with my faith pretty bad at the time, because all the things that I know, the knowledge, how the Bible is flawed, how, there's just no way it's inspired. And I'm just like looking, all the things that I was taught as a child are coming unraveled. And I was discovering that naturalists and atheists and other critics had better explanations than magic from a superpower being. And so I had run across this quote by Dan Barker, where Dan, I think he was debating with somebody in a video, or I think I also read it too, and I wanted to hear more about it. So I got out the debate where he says this, and I can't remember which one it is. And I tried to find it, and I couldn't find it. But off the cuff, maybe somebody can show it. But he makes the statement, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, the Bible, sin is a problem of the Bible's creation. In other words, sin is a made-up concept created by the Bible. The Bible creates a solution for a problem of its own making. Would you thank somebody for cutting you and then selling you a Band-Aid? Because that's essentially what the Bible does and preachers do with the Bible. And I was wrestling with this heavy, and I'm preaching on sin. And I'm going to the pulpit, and I'm trying to figure out how to reconcile this, because I'm struggling. Okay, if I set the Bible aside and I have this definition of this is what sin is. Now, a lot of people criticize me at this point, saying, well, of course sin exists. Can't you see the suffering, death, and people make bad decisions? Those things are all true, but why do we call that sin is purely a creation of the Bible. It's the Bible's way of dealing with that problem, not the way we deal with it as humanity as a whole. Other religions call that something else. But sin has a very specific biblical definition. It is a lawless state that is created by disobedience to the law of God, okay, which results in the consequence of sin, and sin leads to death. It's a much, you can't just say suffering, therefore sin, okay, because that's not what the Bible says sin is. Sin has a very specific definition. And if you set aside the Bible and you look at this and say, how would I prove that such a definition? Would I even come to such a conclusion just looking at the world? And the answer is no. There's no empirical evidence that sin exists as it is defined by the Bible. It just doesn't exist. And I realized that Dan Barker was very right. And I'm preaching a message on sin, and I'm struggling with this really hard all week. And I'm figuring that the Holy Spirit or whoever is going to tell me the answer as I'm preaching, because that happened a lot in my ministry. I'd be preaching and I'd think of something and I would think it was God or whatever. And it really was me, because when you verbalize things and you talk about things, you end up, coming up with ideas. And that's what was happening to me. So I was thinking that was going to happen, but I got to the end of my sermon and it still hadn't happened. And, I closed in prayer over the word. I sat down. My worship leader got up, and at that point they take up an offering and they, talk about a few things. I get up, pray for the offering, then sit back down. But during this time of sitting down and getting up and them leading a hymn and all this other stuff, I'm sitting there and thinking to myself, son of a bitch, Ed, Dan Barker's right. Sin is made up. We just straight made it up. Okay. And you make your living cutting people with this idea of sin, and then selling them the Band-Aid from the pulpit that it's the gospel of Jesus Christ that covers that. And out of gratitude for you cutting them and then giving them a Band-Aid, these people put their money in the basket and it pays your salary. It was an incredibly depressing, low moment for me. I got up and, like I said, my depression doesn't, in part one, my depression doesn't really influence how I get along in life. It influences my relationships, because I'll get into a depressive state and I just don't want to deal with people. It's probably why I'm very introverted. But it becomes a problem at this moment, because I went through the motions of doing the thing. But at that moment, I realized I don't believe in any of this Christianity stuff. It can't be true. It's garbage. And I began to, and at this church, I'd also gone through the life of Christ, and that had sown a lot of seeds too about whether Jesus Christ was anything more than a legend, which is what I think he is. And I suddenly realized that, holy shit, you make your living as a fraud. Now, a lot of people criticize preachers for being fraudulent, and deliberately so, and that is not always true for everybody. There are some very sincere preachers who really believe this stuff and who suddenly find themselves in a position where this is their career and they don't have anything. So immediately after that, I said, well, I got to find a way to find a new career, okay, because this isn't going to work, but I can't give up the one I've got. This is how I make my living. So I kept preaching, and I kept, I said, I can lead a service. I can do the administration. I can do all that stuff, and it'll be just a job. And it was just a job. And I immediately sought entry into an university. And now I realize, this was the deconversion moment was in the 2014, because in 2015, I started my work working on a political science degree at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan. And so I started that, and everybody's kind of scratching their head while I'm going back to school. And I said, I need another career on the side. This isn't making me enough money. At the time, I was making $300 a week, which, good thing that me and my wife were still living with our family, because otherwise I wouldn't have made it. And they were gracious because we were in the ministry, so. But I'm living with my mom. We're all living with our mom, the whole family, kind of like the Waltons, which I don't really have a problem with, to be honest. If your family's tight like that and they want to all live together, that's their business. It saves a lot of money. But I was also thankful for the ministry, because I had a lot of time. Pastors always want to talk about how hard they work. Not really. I'll be blunt. One of the chief things about the job is you only have to show up one day a week, really. You only have to show up at events, do your thing on the events. What you do with all the other time, a lot of people call you and you have to deal with stuff. But that doesn't really take as long as everybody says it does either, especially when you're like me. I go in, deal with the problem, and leave. So that's kind of what was my motive. Maybe that's why I wasn't such a great minister. But in any case, I'm getting to the point where I have to go through school. Now, what role did getting my degree, a secular degree, have in my deconversion? Well, I started to study human behavior and the facts about human behavior. I also had to take some general education courses, which involve science. Oh no. And math and statistics and actually looking at information and data. I often joke that my political science degree is a BS, which is a Bachelor in Science. But when you say I have a BS in political science, it actually comes off pretty funny. But I also started to study economics and international business as minors. I began to just absorb a lot of information. Two significant classes, well, a significant grouping of classes were my political science classes, where I realized, you know what, human beings aren't as bad as Christians make them out to be. The world isn't going to hell in a handbasket. I didn't have to read Pinker to realize this with his data and research, but I suddenly began to realize, things are getting better most of the time. And there's a few bad apples, but they don't actually spoil the whole bunch. That's not a good analogy when you come to human beings. Basically, people are empathic, and so they work for each other's survival by nature. And so that kind of threw the whole sin thing right under the bus. And then late in my education, I took a class called Introduction to Genetics. And I took that for a couple reasons. One, Christian that believes in evolution, and I wanted to find out what the genetic evidence for it was. And then also, politically science-wise, genetics can be a very interesting political issue, particularly when it deals with people who have, say, a double XY or XYY, or what do you do with these people? How are they classified? They're not male, female. What are they? And other designations that become genetic and biological. And, we try to force biology to be the norm. And I suddenly realized, holy shit, they're right. Somebody could be living in a biologically male body, but have a female brain. Who knew? I suddenly realized that it was possible. Now, whether it happens in every case when people are trans, I don't know. You really have to talk. That's why trans people go through a lot of counseling, and rightly so, because you have to determine whether this is true. But I suddenly realized that it was quite possible for this to be true, and that would mean a major goof by a creative God that is a good designer. And the more I studied genetics, I'm like, holy shit. It's not random, but it's basically responding to the environment. And that which survives is that which survives. Okay, the stuff that doesn't work just kind of doesn't get passed on. And I suddenly realized that the explanations that the naturalists and other people had were far better. They're incomplete, make no doubt. But I also realized I can't put God into that gap. And so I realized my faith was gone, but I kept preaching in the church. Now, here's what happens from a deconversion point of view. When you're a pastor, you're still preaching and still doing your job, but you don't believe shit. Okay? Stress. You're afraid that that's going to come out. You're afraid that that's going to be... I am not a good liar by nature, and I had to work at it. And thankfully, most of my people were pretty moderate in their beliefs anyway, so they never really asked any hard questions. They just came to church because they wanted to come to church. Sing a few hymns, hear an encouraging word, and go on about their week. And that was cool with me. So I didn't really find myself challenged, except personally I was struggling with it. I'm still doing a job that I don't believe in, and I was starting to dislike it. As I mentioned in my first video, the person who was the strong man in that church started to oppose almost everything I tried. And eventually, I think in 2016, I took a sabbatical. When I came back from sabbatical, I wrote a letter to the board saying, hey, are you going to let me be in charge or what? And it wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at this one person who I was beginning to realize was a problem. Now, I was still considering myself friends with this guy. To me, this was a friendly disagreement as far as I was concerned. I did not realize how deep this guy was into the problem. Now, this plays into the end of the story when I leave the ministry, so that's why I'm mentioning it here. But in early 2018, my organist died. Now, this was significant to me because it really marked the end of an era of the church to me. Because since I had been there, I had three major musicians, musically talented people that made the church a real joy to go to. If you were into musical aesthetics, even as an unbeliever, you would have loved coming to my church and listening to these people. My pianist was a brilliant pianist that just made things sound awesome. My organist was a classical organist that could play at a very, very high level. And he was one of the few people around that could play an organ at that level in our area. So it was a real treat to listen to him. And I had one woman who just was a singer extraordinaire, and she just had this beautiful voice. I had several people with beautiful voices, but she just kind of stood out. By this time, the pianist and the woman who could sing had died, and with my organist death, I didn't have anything left. This church had made its business on its music, and now the music was gone. So I found myself really depressed because I really liked this guy. We were good friends. One of the things he said about a month before he died, he thanked me. He said, "You really changed the atmosphere of this church because it had been really oppressive before." He says, "And you've made it a joy to come here and work and a joy to play." And then a month later he dies. And so I was having a real hard time with it. Now, at this time, I had befriended a young woman who was having a real hard time, and she had left her family in order to get away with some other family members, and she was attending the church. And I was helping everybody else deal with the organist's death, but nobody was helping me. And all of a sudden, this young lady texts me and says, "How are you doing?" Now, nobody else is asking me that question. My wife isn't asking me that question. Nobody's asking, and she meant it. When I said, "Oh, I'm okay," I said, "You don't really mean that, do you?" I mean, she got past the bullshit, is what I'm saying. And so I started to talk to her because she was going through a lot of the same things I was going through mentally. And so it became a natural friendship, really, at first. Now you can probably see where this is going because I'm going through a lot of stress being deconverting. I'm having a rough time with my church because now I've got this guy that doesn't want to change anything, even though literally the entire music of our church is gone and we have to change. But he didn't want to change. And so he's fighting me tooth and nail. I'm having a hard time. One thing leads to another, and I'm in an emotional affair with this young woman. And then, things were going bad. There's no good reasons for an affair. Well, there's no good excuses for an affair, I should say. But there's plenty of damn good reasons, I now realize, psychologically and socially. You just get to a point where your life isn't working with the people that you have, and you're trying for something else. And somebody comes along and offers you something that you don't have, which is, the ability to breathe and to be yourself and to be truthful. And I was with this one woman, and she was truthful with me, at least so I thought. So in May of 2018, I'm going through the struggle. I'm really having a hard time. I'm in an emotional affair and have been for a week or so. And it's coming unraveled because she couldn't keep it up and I couldn't keep it up. And we eventually told everybody the truth. And that's how I left my church, pretty unceremoniously. And I wrote a letter of resignation. I put it in the hand of this guy because I still considered him my friend, even though we were having disagreements about the direction of the church. Didn't think it really went beyond that. A lot of things would happen in the next week that would suddenly realize who this guy really was. But I left it to him, and then he calls me up a day later and says, "Hey, I want you to take the line out of this about the affair. I mean, you can come back in the next week, and we can talk about that. You can tell people what was going on yourself." And I said, "Well, yeah, I kind of want to do that. I just don't want to face the congregation this first week, and I just want to let them know what's going on. I want to resign officially." And so when that happened, it just kind of went downhill from there. What he did is he convinced me to remove this line. Then he got up there and told the story himself, which made it look like I was hiding something. And then everybody was mad at me. And I'm like, well, I can't go into the church now. And I haven't been back since, by the way. And I came out of that. Now, this really creates a problem because I'm separated from my wife at the time because, of course, the affair came to light. She went off and did her thing, and I was staying at my house. The affair didn't go well. It ended before the summer was over, and I haven't talked to her since the early part of August of 2018. So that kind of ended badly. I ended up being pretty alone. I reconciled with my wife probably out of that. We finally sat down and talked about things. So through all that, though, the deconversion issue was, now what do I do? I still had a year of school to go, so I continued on in school. I found another job, which I still have. It's not the job I want, but I'm still working on things. And through this things, though, I look back and I said, well, God, that guy was pretty much a sociopath. He got off controlling people, and once I screwed up, I was just another person to control and get out of his life. So, no whatever. It's things like that deconversion causes you to see. And over the last 2 years, including a year of this channel, I've worked through those issues. I got involved with the clergy project. We got some counseling. Which also got me some career counseling, which is why I'm heading the direction I am. But I look back on it, I think to myself, as personally rough as it was, a lot of people want to accuse me of that's why I left the faith, I just had 3 bad churches and I just don't want to deal with it anymore. No, it was an intellectual seed that was planted in seminary right before my dad died. And it just took a hell of a lot of time to grow because I was constantly chopping it off with my own personal religious experiences and my desire to see my father and my investment in my career. This is what makes deconversion for pastors really hard, because it's not just losing your faith. If you're just sitting in the pew and you're like, screw this shit, you can walk out of church and never come back. But when you're a minister, you can't do that. Socially, you just can't. Career-wise, you can't. And you end up with a lot more problems. That's why I'm going to end this video the same way I ended my other deconversion video, saying if you're a young person thinking about the ministry, don't. Trust me, what you want to do is go get a degree where you can make money and you can be comfortable, okay? And you can be useful to society as a whole, not just Christians. And if in 10 years you still want to go into the ministry, after you've done that and you start reading the critics and taking them to heart, and you still want to go into the ministry, then go into the ministry. Obviously, you're hell-bent on it, go for it. But then you'll at least have a career on the side that you can hang on to for your money. Because the ministry is going to go downhill in the United States. We're already seeing it. The vast majority of us were like me. I never had a church over 50, 60 people at any time. And that's the way it is. Most of the time it was 30 people. And that's kind of the way the ministry is for most people. And you'll never make enough money on it to retire, and you'll never do anything. And quite frankly, it's make-believe. And you need to avoid it. I tell my story mostly for those of you that are in the ministry and you're wondering what the hell to do because you don't believe anymore. And you want to think, oh, am I the only one going? No, you're not. A lot of ministers go through this. Here's what my recommendation: if you are truly an atheist now, and if you were to examine your faith and there's nothing left, I have one place to recommend: the Clergy Project. Call them up, get in contact with them, find a way to get in contact with them. They'll help you out. They'll help you walk through it. You might even see my ugly mug from time to time, though they don't participate as much as they used to, because I'm past that stage that they help you with, which is the crisis stage. If you're a person who's younger and thinking about the ministry, my story is for you too, because I'm trying to get you to avoid spending, like I did, 20, 30 years in something that ends up being nothing to you. Because the more you study, the more you know about your faith, the more it's going to start to crumble. The more you really look into the claims of your faith and compare it with reality, you're going to find out reality changes everything. And in the end, I went from a devout believer to an atheist, because ultimately, at the end of the day, I can't prove any supernatural claim, which means they're all made up as far as I'm concerned. And until they provide evidence for their claims, the default position for me is atheism, to just go through my life and do my thing and realize that someday I am going to end, and that's the way it should be. And I still struggle with things, and I still go forward with things, but I want everybody to understand that things have gotten better. And I want to end it on a little bit more positive note. This channel has really helped me get through a lot of things. It's been my rock when I haven't always had one. I've struggled sometimes to post videos. I've had weeks where I didn't post any, and that's because I was going through stuff. But when I come out the other side and I get in front of this microphone, in front of this camera, and I talk to you about different issues related to atheism, what's going on in the world, and things like that, I realize how much this helps. It's getting it off my chest. And so, yes, this time I told my deconversion story. It's 2 parts. It's probably 50 minutes long instead of the 22 minutes or whatever it was the first time. But there's a lot more to consider, and the reason is this channel. And so to all of you that have subscribed over this last year, which is roughly comes out to about 5 every month, it's not a huge number. Thank you. You guys are great. And if you stuck around to the end of this whole 2-part series, awesome on you. You're awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it. Because the important thing about this deconversion story is I hope there's more of them. I hope more people come to the realization that their faith is a useless waste of time, money, and energy. And we become more conscious of the human needs around us and start putting that time, money, and energy into helping the people around us and helping others. Because that's the real truth of what we need to do as a human race, that we need to make this existence as light a burden for everybody as possible. I want to thank you for sticking around again. Agree with me, disagree with me, I don't care. But thank you for being there, and I appreciate it. And hopefully someday, if I haven't done so already, I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Ed Rabyd, also known as the Rabid Atheist, signing off and wishing you a good day.